Sometimes the most powerful moments happen in the most ordinary places. What started as cruel laughter in a small-town coffee shop would transform into a story that reminds us why we should never judge others by their appearance. When Sarah Martinez rolled up her sleeves that Tuesday morning, she had no idea that the tattoo she tried so hard to hide would become the bridge between her painful past and an unexpected future. The man sitting quietly in the corner booth wasn't just any customer, he was someone whose own story would intertwine with hers in ways that would leave everyone speechless. This is the true story of how a moment of cruelty became a catalyst for healing, honor, and the kind of human connection that reminds us why kindness matters more than we ever imagined. Sarah Martinez arrived at Sunrise Coffee 15 minutes early, just like she had every morning for the past 8 months. The small coffee shop in Millbrook, Tennessee, wasn't much to look at from the outside, but it had become her sanctuary in ways she never expected. She tied her apron around her waist and pulled down the sleeves of her long-sleeved shirt, a habit so automatic she barely noticed doing it anymore. The morning routine was always the same. Check the espresso machine, count the register, arrange the pastries that arrived fresh from the local bakery. Sarah found comfort in the predictability. After everything she had been through, predictability felt like a luxury. At 26, Sarah had the kind of quiet beauty that people noticed but rarely commented on. Her dark hair was always pulled back in a neat ponytail, and her brown eyes held a warmth that made customers feel welcome, even when she was having her worst days. She had learned to smile on command, a skill that served her well in customer service but sometimes left her feeling hollow inside. The bell above the door chimed at exactly 7 o'clock as Mrs. Henderson, one of their regulars, shuffled in for her daily medium coffee with extra cream. Sarah had it ready before the elderly woman reached the counter. "You're an angel, dear," Mrs. Henderson said, pressing a dollar tip into Sarah's hand despite her protests. "How are you doing today?" "I'm good, Mrs. Henderson. How's your granddaughter doing in college?" As Mrs. Henderson launched into stories about her granddaughter's studies, Sarah listened with genuine interest. These small connections with regular customers had become some of the brightest moments in her days. They didn't know her story, didn't look at her with pity or judgment. To them, she was just Sarah, the friendly girl who remembered their coffee orders and asked about their families. The morning rush picked up around 8:30. Office workers grabbed their caffeine fixes before heading to work, parents ordered elaborate drinks after dropping kids at school, and local retirees settled in for their daily social hour. Sarah moved through the routine with practiced efficiency, her movements smooth and confident behind the counter. It was during the lull between the morning rush and lunch crowd that they walked in. 3 women, probably in their early 30s, wearing expensive workout clothes and carrying designer handbags. Sarah recognized the type immediately, the kind of women who had everything handed to them and wore their privilege like expensive perfume. "This place is so quaint," the blonde one said, her voice carrying that particular tone of someone slumming it for the experience. "Very authentic small-town America." Sarah approached the counter with her standard welcoming smile. "Good morning. What can I get for you today?" The redhead stepped forward, looking at the menu board with exaggerated concentration. "This is so hard to choose from. Do you have anything that's, actually healthy?" "I'm trying to maintain my figure for my husband's work events." "We have several lighter options," Sarah replied patiently. "Our cold brew with almond milk is popular, or I can make any of our lattes with sugar-free syrup and non-dairy milk." As Sarah prepared their orders, the women continued their conversation, their voices carrying easily throughout the small space. They talked about their yoga instructor, their upcoming trips to Europe, and their frustrations with finding good help for their homes. Sarah had heard variations of these conversations countless times, and, normally, they just rolled off her back like water. The trouble started when she reached for the steamed milk. The motion caused her sleeve to right up slightly, exposing just an inch of the tattoo on her forearm. It was barely visible, just the edge of some black ink, but the blonde woman's eyes locked onto it immediately. "Oh my God," she said, loud enough for everyone in the coffee shop to hear. "Look at her arm." Sarah quickly pulled her sleeve down, her cheeks burning with embarrassment. She had been so careful for months, always wearing long sleeves, always being mindful of her movements. But, in that one careless moment, her armor had slipped. I bet there's more where that came from, the redhead whispered, though her whisper was clearly intended to be heard. You know what they say about girls with tattoos? The third woman, a brunette who had been quiet until now, giggled. My mother always said you can tell a lot about a person by their tattoos. Usually nothing good. Sarah's hands shook slightly as she finished their drinks, but she managed to keep her voice steady. Your drinks are ready. The blonde woman leaned across the counter as she took her cup, her voice dropping to what she probably thought was a confidential whisper. Honey, you know there are places that can remove those things, right? Might want to look into it if you ever want to get a real job. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had heard worse, much worse, but something about the casual cruelty of it, the way this stranger felt entitled to comment on her body and her life, made her feel sick. She managed a tight smile and thanked them for their business, watching as they found a table near the window and continued their commentary. I just don't understand why someone would do that to themselves, the redhead continued, not bothering to lower her voice anymore. It's so permanent. And unprofessional. Probably some kind of phase, the blonde added. You know how some people are. Always looking for attention. Sarah retreated to the back area, pretending to restock supplies while trying to regain her composure. She had worked so hard to build a life here, to find a place where she could just be normal. These women didn't know anything about her, about what her tattoos meant or what she had been through. They saw ink on skin and made assumptions about her character, her worth, her entire life story. The tattoo they had glimpsed was part of something larger, something that told a story of pain and healing, of loss and honor, of a love that had been cut tragically short. But, to them, it was just evidence of poor judgment, a mark that made her less than respectable in their eyes. She took several deep breaths, reminding herself of the techniques her therapist had taught her for managing anxiety. Count to 10. Focus on your breathing. Remember that their opinions don't define you. It had taken her 2 years of therapy to get to a place where she could mostly believe those words, and moments like this still had the power to shake her foundation. When she returned to the front counter, she noticed a man sitting alone in the corner booth. He was older, probably in his 50s, with graying hair and the kind of posture that suggested military training. He was nursing a black coffee and reading something on his tablet, but Sarah got the impression he had been watching the interaction with the three women. Their eyes met briefly, and she saw something in his expression that wasn't pity or judgment. It was understanding, maybe even recognition. But, before she could think about it too much, new customers entered, and she had to focus on taking orders and making drinks. The three women finally left around 11, their voices carrying one last round of commentary as they walked past the window. Sarah watched them climb into an expensive SUV and drive away, probably heading to their next stop in what she imagined was a day full of leisure activities and casual cruelty. Some people, a voice said behind her. She turned to see the man from the corner booth standing at the counter, his empty coffee cup in hand. Up close, she could see that her initial impression had been correct. There was definitely something military about his bearing. His clothes were casual but neat, and he had the kind of watchful awareness that she had learned to recognize in veterans. I'm sorry you had to witness that, Sarah said, reaching for his cup. Can I get you a refill? Please, he said, sliding the cup across the counter. And don't apologize for their behavior. That's on them, not you. His voice was kind but firm, with just a hint of an accent she couldn't quite place. As Sarah refilled his coffee, she found herself wondering about his story. There was something about him that felt familiar, though she was certain they had never met. I'm James, by the way, he said, accepting the steaming cup. James Mitchell. Sarah, she replied, grateful that he was treating her like a person rather than a spectacle. Nice to meet you. Likewise, James said. This is a good coffee shop. I can see why the locals like it. Are you visiting from out of town? Something like that, he said, and Sarah sensed there was more to the story but didn't push. I'll probably be around for a few days. This seems like a nice place to work quietly. Sarah nodded, understanding the appeal. Sunrise Coffee had attracted several remote workers and digital nomads over the years. The Wi-Fi was reliable, the coffee was good, and the atmosphere was generally peaceful. Today's incident with the three women was definitely an exception rather than the rule. "Well, feel free to make yourself at home," Sarah said. "Let me know if you need anything." James nodded and returned to his booth, but not before giving her another one of those looks that seemed to see more than most people bothered to. Sarah went back to her work, trying to shake off the lingering effects of the earlier confrontation. She had learned that the best way to deal with these moments was to focus on the positive interactions, the customers like Mrs. Henderson and, now James, who treated her with basic human decency. The lunch crowd began filtering in around noon, and Sarah found herself grateful for the distraction. There was something therapeutic about the mechanical process of taking orders, operating machines, and creating the small moments of satisfaction that came with a perfectly crafted drink. It reminded her that she had value, that she could do something well and make people happy, even if it was just for a few minutes. As she worked, she caught sight of James in her peripheral vision. He seemed to be genuinely focused on whatever he was reading, but occasionally she would notice him glancing around the coffee shop with that same watchful awareness she had noticed earlier. There was something comforting about his presence, as if having someone like him around made the space feel safer. The afternoon passed without incident. Regular customers came and went, office workers grabbed their afternoon caffeine fixes, and students settled in for study sessions. Sarah found her rhythm again, the familiar routine helping to wash away the unpleasantness of the morning. It wasn't until she was wiping down tables during the late afternoon lull that she realized James was still there, still working quietly in his corner booth. She had refilled his coffee twice more without really thinking about it, but now she wondered what kind of work kept someone occupied in a coffee shop for an entire day. As if sensing her attention, he looked up from his tablet and smiled. It was a genuine smile, the kind that reached his eyes and made her feel like he actually saw her as a person rather than just the girl behind the counter. "Long day?" he asked. "The good kind of long," Sarah replied, returning his smile. "Busy keeps the time moving." "I know what you mean," James said. "Sometimes staying busy is the best medicine for whatever ails you." There was something in the way he said it that made Sarah think he spoke from experience. She found herself wondering what kind of ailments someone like him might be nursing, but she knew better than to pry. Everyone had their stories, their reasons for seeking refuge in quiet coffee shops and familiar routines. As closing time approached, Sarah began her end-of-day tasks while James continued working. She had started to assume he would stay until she kicked him out, but around 5:30, he began packing up his things. "Thanks for the coffee and the hospitality," he said, approaching the counter one last time. "This really is a nice place." "Thank you," Sarah replied. "Will we see you tomorrow?" "Probably," James said. "I like the atmosphere here. Very peaceful." As he headed toward the door, Sarah called after him. "James?" He turned back, eyebrows raised. "Thanks," she said. "For earlier, I mean. For treating me like a person." James studied her face for a moment, and again she had the feeling that he was seeing more than most people bothered to look for. "Everyone deserves to be treated like a person," he said simply. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Then, he was gone, leaving Sarah alone with her thoughts and the lingering sense that their brief interaction had been more significant than either of them had acknowledged. She finished closing the shop and headed home to her small apartment, unaware that tomorrow would bring revelations that would change everything she thought she knew about judgments, assumptions, and the power of understanding between strangers. The next morning arrived with the kind of gray skies that seemed to match Sarah's mood. She had spent most of the night replaying the encounter with the three women, their words echoing in her mind like a song she couldn't forget. Even James's kindness hadn't been enough to completely wash away the sting of their cruelty. Sarah arrived at Sunrise Coffee earlier than usual, needing the extra time to center herself before facing another day of interactions with strangers. She went through her opening routine mechanically, her mind elsewhere. As she arranged the pastries in the display case, she caught sight of her reflection in the glass and automatically checked that her sleeves were pulled down properly. The habit had become so ingrained that she sometimes did it even when she was alone. The morning started quietly. Mrs. Henderson came in for her usual coffee, chatting about her cat's recent visit to the vet. A few other regulars stopped by, creating the comfortable rhythm that Sarah had come to depend on. It was almost 9 o'clock when James walked through the door, carrying a leather messenger bag and wearing the same kind of casual but neat clothes he had worn the day before. "Morning, Sarah," he said, approaching the counter with that gentle smile that had made her feel seen as a person rather than judged as a curiosity. "Good morning, James. Black coffee?" "You've got a good memory," he replied. "That would be perfect." As Sarah prepared his coffee, she found herself studying him more carefully. There was definitely something military about the way he carried himself, but it was more than just posture. It was the way his eyes constantly took in his surroundings, the way he chose the seat that gave him the best view of the entire coffee shop, the way he moved with economy and purpose. She had learned to recognize these traits in other veterans who had found their way to Millbrook over the years. "Are you military?" she asked, then immediately regretted the question. "I'm sorry, that's probably too personal." "Not too personal at all," James said, accepting his coffee cup. "Retired Marine Corps. 28 years. "Thank you for your service," Sarah said, the words automatic but sincere. James nodded, but she noticed a slight tightness around his eyes that suggested the simple phrase carried more weight for him than it might for others. "What about you? You seem to know the type." Sarah hesitated. This was dangerous territory, the kind of conversation that could lead to questions she wasn't ready to answer. But there was something about James that made her want to trust him, something in his manner that suggested he would understand complexity and nuance rather than jumping to simple judgments. "My husband was Army," she said finally. "Deployed twice to Afghanistan." The past tense hung in the air between them, and Sarah watched as understanding dawned in James's expression. He didn't ask the obvious question, didn't push for details she might not be ready to share. Instead, he simply nodded. "I'm sorry," he said, and she could hear in those two words that he meant it, that he understood exactly what that past tense implied. "Thank you," Sarah replied, grateful that he hadn't asked for specifics or launched into platitudes about heroism and sacrifice. Those conversations, well-intentioned as they usually were, always left her feeling more alone than before. James returned to his corner booth, and Sarah went back to her work, but something had shifted between them. The acknowledgement of their shared connection to military life, to loss, had created a different kind of understanding. She found herself more aware of his presence, comforted by the knowledge that someone in the coffee shop understood at least part of her story. The morning rush proceeded normally until about 10:30, when a familiar SUV pulled up outside. Sarah's heart sank as she recognized the vehicle from the day before. Sure enough, the three women from yesterday's incident walked through the door, their voices already audible before they reached the counter. "I still can't believe how unprofessional that girl looked yesterday," the blonde one was saying. "I mean, tattoos are one thing, but in a service job? It just seems inappropriate." Sarah's hands clenched involuntarily, but she forced herself to approach the counter with what she hoped was a professional expression. "Good morning. What can I get for you?" The redhead barely looked at her. 3 skinny vanilla lattes with oat milk. And make sure they're actually skinny this time. Yesterday's drink tasted like it had full sugar. Sarah bit back the response that yesterday's drink had been made exactly to specifications. Instead, she focused on preparing their orders, keeping her movements careful and controlled to avoid any chance of her sleeves riding up again. But the women weren't finished with their commentary. As Sarah worked, they continued their conversation, their voices carrying throughout the small space with what seemed like deliberate intent. "I was telling my husband about it last night," the brunette said. "He says you can always tell when someone has made poor life choices. It shows up in how they present themselves." "Exactly," the blonde agreed. "I mean, what kind of person gets tattoos like that? It's like they're advertising that they don't make good decisions." Sarah's hands began to shake slightly as she steamed the milk. The words were hitting closer to home than the women could possibly know, touching on insecurities and grief that she was still learning to navigate. She had gotten her tattoos for reasons that had nothing to do with poor judgment and everything to do with love, memory, and the desperate need to carry something permanent of her husband with her always. "I bet there's a whole sob story behind it," the redhead continued. There always is with people like that. They think having a tragic past excuses everything. That was when Sarah's composure finally cracked. Her husband's death hadn't been a sob story or an excuse for anything. It had been the defining tragedy of her life, a loss so profound that some days she still wasn't sure how she managed to get out of bed. The tattoos on her arm told the story of Marcus Rodriguez, her husband of 3 years who had died when an IED destroyed his convoy outside Kandahar. They told the story of a love that had been cut short, of promises that would never be fulfilled, of a future that had died alongside the only man she had ever truly loved. The cup in her hand slipped, sending hot milk splashing across the counter and onto the floor. Sarah stood frozen for a moment, staring at the mess, feeling tears threatening to spill over despite her best efforts to maintain control. "Oh my God," the blonde woman said with obvious disgust. "She can't even do her job properly. This is exactly what I'm talking about." That was when James stood up from his corner booth. Sarah had been so focused on trying to clean up the spilled milk that she hadn't noticed him moving, but suddenly, he was standing beside the counter, his presence solid and reassuring. He didn't say anything immediately, just handed Sarah some napkins from the dispenser and helped her wipe up the mess. "Thank you," she whispered, grateful for his quiet support. "No problem," James replied, then turned to face the 3 women. "Ladies," he said, his voice carrying an authority that immediately commanded attention. "I couldn't help but overhear your conversation." The blonde woman bristled. "Excuse me? This is a private conversation." "Not when you're having it loud enough for everyone in the coffee shop to hear," James replied calmly. "And certainly not when you're using it to deliberately upset someone who's just trying to do her job." "We're customers," the redhead said indignantly. "We have a right to talk about whatever we want." "You absolutely do," James agreed. "Just like I have a right to point out that you're being deliberately cruel to someone who has shown you nothing but courtesy." Sarah watched the exchange with a mixture of gratitude and anxiety. She appreciated James stepping in, but she was also terrified that his intervention would only make things worse, that the women would escalate their complaints or demand to speak to a manager. "Look," the brunette said, trying to sound reasonable. "We're not trying to be mean. We're just saying that there are standards for professional appearance, and tattoos send a certain message." "And what message is that?" James asked. "That someone makes poor choices," the blonde replied immediately. "That they're probably not the kind of person you want representing your business." James was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah could see something changing in his expression. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that hadn't been there before. "Can I tell you about some tattoos I know?" he said. "There's a young Marine I served with who has the coordinates of a battlefield in Iraq tattooed on his chest. It's the place where he lost his best friend, and he wears those numbers so he'll never forget the cost of freedom." The women shifted uncomfortably, but James continued. "There's a Navy corpsman who has the names of every soldier he couldn't save tattooed down his spine. 23 names. He carries their memory with him everywhere he goes." Sarah's breath caught as she began to understand where James was heading with this. "There's a young widow I know who has a memorial tattoo for her husband, a soldier who died serving his country. She wears his memory on her skin because it's the only way she can still feel close to him." The coffee shop had gone completely silent. Even the background music seemed to have faded away. The 3 women were staring at James with expressions that ranged from uncomfortable to openly hostile. "Are you suggesting that this girl is some kind of war widow?" the blonde asked skeptically. James looked directly at Sarah, and, in his eyes, she saw understanding, recognition, and something that looked like protective anger. "I'm suggesting," James said quietly, "that you don't know anything about her story. And maybe, just maybe, you should think before you judge someone based on their appearance." Sarah felt tears threatening again, but this time they weren't tears of humiliation. James had somehow understood, without her having to explain, exactly what her tattoos meant. He had defended not just her right to have them, but the sacred nature of what they represented. The blonde woman straightened, her face flushing with anger. "I don't appreciate being lectured by some random stranger." We're paying customers, and if this establishment can't maintain professional standards, then perhaps you should find somewhere else to get your coffee," James interrupted, his voice still calm but carrying an unmistakable edge of authority.
"Are you telling us to leave?" the redhead demanded.
"I'm suggesting that if you can't treat other human beings with basic decency, you might want to reconsider where you choose to spend your money." The three women exchanged glances, clearly debating whether to escalate the confrontation. Sarah held her breath, wondering if she was about to lose her job over this situation. Finally, the blonde woman grabbed her purse. "This is ridiculous. We don't have to put up with this kind of treatment."
"No," James agreed. "You don't. Have a nice day."
As the women stormed out, their voices carrying back through the door as they complained to each other about the injustice of being called out for their behavior, Sarah found herself alone with James and a coffee shop full of other customers who had witnessed the entire exchange.
"Are you okay?" James asked, his attention immediately returning to Sarah. She nodded, though she wasn't sure it was entirely true. "Thank you," she said. "You didn't have to do that."
"Yes, I did," James replied firmly.
"No one has the right to treat you that way."
Sarah looked around the coffee shop, suddenly aware that other customers might have opinions about what had just transpired. But, instead of judgment or discomfort, she saw nods of approval and expressions of support. Mrs. Henderson, who had come in during the confrontation, gave her a thumbs up from her usual table. "You handled yourself with grace," James said.
"Don't let anyone tell you otherwise."
As James returned to his booth and the normal rhythm of the coffee shop resumed, Sarah found herself thinking about his words. He had understood her story without her having to explain it, had defended her honor without making her feel like a victim. For the first time since Marcus's death, someone had seen her tattoos and understood their true meaning. But, as the day progressed, Sarah began to wonder about James himself. His defense of her had been passionate and specific, suggesting a deep understanding of military loss and sacrifice. His presence in the coffee shop, his watchful awareness, his immediate recognition of what her tattoos might represent, it all suggested someone with his own complex story. She found herself watching him throughout the day, noticing details she had missed before. The way he unconsciously straightened when he heard certain words. The careful way he positioned himself in relation to exits and entrances. The occasional distant look that suggested his mind was somewhere else entirely. As evening approached and the coffee shop began to empty, Sarah realized that while James had seen and understood her story, she still knew almost nothing about his. The mutual recognition they had shared was built on common experience with military life and loss, but she sensed there were layers to his story that she hadn't even begun to uncover. When James finally packed up his things to leave, he stopped at the counter one more time. "Sarah," he said, "I want you to know that what happened today wasn't your fault. Some people react to what they don't understand with fear and cruelty. That says nothing about you and everything about them." "Thank you," Sarah replied. "For understanding. For stepping in. For everything." James nodded, but she could see something in his expression that suggested he was wrestling with his own thoughts. "Can I ask you something?" he said finally. "Of course." "Your husband's unit. Do you remember what it was?" Sarah felt her heart rate increase slightly. It was an unusual question, but not an unreasonable one given their earlier conversation. "2nd Battalion, 7th Infantry Regiment," she said. "Why do you ask?" James went very still, and Sarah watched as something shifted in his expression. For a moment, he looked like he was seeing a ghost. "Nothing," he said finally, but his voice sounded different. "Just curious. I'll see you tomorrow." As he left the coffee shop, Sarah stood behind the counter trying to process what had just happened. There had been something in James's reaction to her husband's unit that suggested recognition, but she couldn't imagine how a Marine would have known army units from Afghanistan. Military branches worked together, but individual units were specific enough that casual recognition seemed unlikely. She finished closing the shop with questions swirling in her mind. James had become more than just a kind customer who understood her story.
Something about Marcus's unit had triggered a reaction in him, and Sarah found herself wondering what connections might exist between her past and the quiet man who had become her unexpected defender. As she locked the door and headed home, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that tomorrow would bring answers to questions she hadn't even known she should be asking. The story of her tattoos had been exposed and defended, but she sensed that the full story of James Mitchell was still hidden beneath the surface, waiting to emerge. Sarah arrived at work the next morning with her mind full of questions about James's reaction to Marcus's unit. She had spent much of the night trying to piece together possible connections, but nothing made sense. Marcus had been Army, stationed at Forward Operating Base Chapman in Afghanistan. James was a retired Marine. Their paths shouldn't have crossed in any meaningful way. But she couldn't forget the look in James's eyes when she had mentioned the 2nd Battalion, 7th Infantry Regiment. It had been recognition, definitely, but also something deeper. Something that looked almost like pain. The morning routine felt different somehow, charged with anticipation. Sarah found herself glancing at the door every few minutes, wondering when James would arrive and whether he would acknowledge the strange moment from the day before. She had learned not to push for information that people weren't ready to share, but the curiosity was eating at her. James walked through the door at 9:15, 15 minutes later than his usual time. Sarah noticed immediately that he looked tired, as if he hadn't slept well. His usual neat appearance was slightly rumpled, and there was a tension in his bearing that hadn't been there before. "Good morning," Sarah said as he approached the counter. "Black coffee?" "Please," James replied, but his usual warm smile was absent. He seemed distracted, almost reluctant to make eye contact. As Sarah prepared his coffee, she debated whether to address the elephant in the room. James had been nothing but kind to her, had defended her against cruel strangers, and had shown understanding about her grief. She didn't want to repay that kindness by pushing him into conversations he didn't want to have. But when she handed him his coffee and saw the troubled expression in his eyes, she made a decision. "James," she said quietly, "is everything okay? You seem different today." James took the coffee cup but didn't move toward his usual booth. Instead, he stood at the counter, apparently wrestling with some internal debate. "Sarah," he said finally, "can I ask you something else about your husband?" "Of course." "What was his name?" The question surprised her. It was personal, more personal than anything James had asked before, but something in his tone made her want to answer. "Marcus Rodriguez," she said. "Staff Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez." James closed his eyes for a moment, and, when he opened them, Sarah saw confirmation of what she had begun to suspect. He had known Marcus somehow. "How?" she whispered. James looked around the coffee shop, noting the other customers scattered throughout the space. "Is there somewhere more private we could talk?" Sarah's heart was racing now. She glanced at the clock and saw that it was still early enough in the morning that she could leave the front counter for a few minutes without causing problems. "The break room," she said, leading him toward the back of the coffee shop. The break room was small and cluttered, with a table barely big enough for 2 people, but it offered privacy. Sarah sat down across from James, her hands folded tightly in her lap to keep them from shaking. "You knew him," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," James replied, his voice heavy. "I knew Marcus." Sarah felt the world tilt slightly. In all the months since she had moved to Millbrook, in all the conversations she had had about Marcus with therapists and support groups and well-meaning friends, no one had ever known him personally. He had become almost mythical in her mind, a perfect memory untouched by outside perspective. "How?" she asked. James was quiet for a long moment, clearly struggling with how much to reveal. When he finally spoke, his words came slowly and carefully. "I was stationed at Bugram Airfield for the last 6 months of my deployment," he said. Joint operations meant that Marines and Army units worked together fairly regularly. FOB Chapman was one of the forward bases that reported through our command structure. Sarah tried to process this information. Marcus had mentioned Bugram occasionally in his letters and video calls, but she had never paid attention to the complex relationships between different bases and units. "But you said you were Marines," she said. Marcus never mentioned working with Marines.
He wouldn't have, necessarily, James explained. My role was administrative.
Liaison work, mostly. Coordinating between different units, making sure everyone had the resources they needed.
There was something in the way he said administrative that made Sarah think there was more to the story, but she didn't push. The important thing was that he had known Marcus, had been part of the same war that had taken her husband's life.
Did you know him well? She asked.
James hesitated again, and Sarah got the impression that he was choosing his words very carefully. I knew of him, he said finally. His unit had a reputation for excellence. Marcus specifically had a reputation as someone who took care of his people. Sarah felt tears threatening. It had been so long since she had heard someone talk about Marcus as a real person rather than a symbol of heroic sacrifice. The fact that James could speak about her husband's reputation, about the kind of soldier he had been, felt like a gift. He did take care of people, she said softly.
That was just who he was.
He always said his job wasn't just to complete the mission, but to bring everyone home. James nodded, but something in his expression suggested that those words had particular significance for him. Sarah, he said, there's something else I need to tell you.
Something about why I'm here in Millbrook.
The serious tone of his voice made Sarah's stomach clench with anxiety.
What do you mean?
I'm not just passing through town, James said. I came here specifically to find you. Sarah stared at him, trying to process what he had just said.
You came here to find me? How did you even know I existed?
Because, James said, his voice barely above a whisper, I was there when Marcus died. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had known that Marcus had died in an IED explosion along with 3 other soldiers from his unit, but the details had always been vague. The army had told her that he had died quickly, that he hadn't suffered, but they had never given her specifics about who else had been there or what exactly had happened. You were there, she repeated, trying to make sense of it. I was part of the investigation team, James explained. When there were casualties involving joint operations, Marines would sometimes be brought in to handle the paperwork, make sure all the proper notifications were made, coordinate with different command structures. Sarah felt like she was drowning in information that was too big to comprehend.
So you were there when they brought him back?
James nodded, his own eyes bright with unshed tears. I was the one who went through his personal effects. I was the one who found the letters you had written to him. The room seemed to be spinning around Sarah. Marcus had carried her letters with him everywhere, had read them over and over until the paper was soft from handling. The thought that James had been the one to find them, to handle them in the aftermath of Marcus's death, was overwhelming. There was one letter in particular, James continued, that he had read so many times the fold marks were wearing through. It was the one where you told him about the tattoo you were planning to get. The one that would tell his story. Sarah's hand automatically moved to her forearm, where underneath her sleeve lay the intricate design that commemorated Marcus's life and service. She had written to him about her plans for the tattoo during his second deployment, describing how she wanted to create something that would keep his memory alive on her skin. He carried that letter in his front pocket, James said. Separate from the others. When we found it, it was clear he had read it hundreds of times.
Why didn't you contact me then?
Sarah asked through her tears. Why wait 2 years?
James took a deep breath before answering. Because I was dealing with my own demons.
Because I thought you deserved better than having some random Marine show up talking about letters and personal effects.
Because I was a coward.
The honesty of his admission hit Sarah almost as hard as the revelation itself. She could see the weight of guilt and regret in his expression, the burden of carrying someone else's story for 2 years without knowing what to do with it. But something changed, she prompted. I started having dreams, James said. Dreams about Marcus, about the letters, about a young woman I had never met who was planning to turn her love into permanent art. I couldn't shake the feeling that I owed him something, owed you something. Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, trying to process the magnitude of what James was telling her.
So you found me.
It took months, James admitted. The Army doesn't exactly hand out widow contact information to random Marines.
But I had some connections, and eventually I was able to track down where you had moved after Marcus died. And you came here to tell me about the letters? James shook his head. I came here because I needed to see that you were okay. Because I had carried this story around for 2 years, and I needed to know that the woman who had written those letters had found a way to survive. Sarah felt a fresh wave of tears threatening. The idea that this man had been carrying concern for her, a complete stranger, for 2 years was almost too much to comprehend. The tattoo, she said suddenly. When those women were making fun of it yesterday, you knew what it really was. I had a pretty good idea, James confirmed. The way you reacted, the way you tried to hide it, it matched what I had imagined based on your letters to Marcus. They sat in silence for several minutes, both of them struggling to process the enormity of the connections that had brought them together. Sarah felt like her entire understanding of the past 2 years had shifted. All this time, she had thought she was alone with her grief and her memories, but James had been carrying part of Marcus's story too. There's something else, James said finally, his voice so quiet she had to lean forward to hear him. What? In your letter about the tattoo, you wrote something to Marcus about how you hoped someday you would meet the people who served with him, so you could share stories about who he really was. Sarah nodded, remembering the letter clearly. She had written it during a particularly lonely night, when the weight of being the only person who knew Marcus as a husband rather than just a soldier had felt overwhelming. I know I'm not exactly who you meant, James continued, but I have stories. Not just about his reputation or his service record, but about Marcus the person. You do? The investigation took several days, James explained. I spent time interviewing the soldiers in his unit, trying to piece together what had happened. They told me about Marcus the sergeant, but they also told me about Marcus the man. About how he carried pictures of you everywhere, how he talked about you constantly, how he had already started planning what he was going to do when he got home. Sarah felt her heart breaking and healing simultaneously. He talked about me? Constantly, James confirmed with a small smile. His soldiers said you were basically legendary in their unit. Marcus had shown your picture to everyone, told them all about how you met, about your plans for after the deployment. They said he lit up every time someone mentioned your name. The bell from the front of the coffee shop chimed, reminding Sarah that she was supposed to be working. But she couldn't bring herself to move, couldn't bear to end this conversation that was giving her pieces of Marcus she had thought were lost forever. I should get back to work, she said reluctantly. Of course, James said, standing up immediately. I'm sorry for keeping you so long. Don't apologize, Sarah said quickly. This is the most important conversation I've had in 2 years. James paused at the doorway to the break room. Sarah, would you be willing to have dinner with me tonight? Not as a date, he added quickly, seeing her expression. But, as 2 people who knew Marcus? I have more stories, if you want to hear them. Sarah considered the offer. Part of her was terrified at the prospect of learning new things about Marcus, afraid that additional information might somehow change her carefully constructed memories of him. But, a larger part of her was desperate to know everything James could tell her. Okay, she said. Yes. I'd like that. There's a diner on Main Street called Betty's. Would 7 o'clock work? Perfect, Sarah replied. As they returned to the main area of the coffee shop, Sarah felt like she was seeing everything with new eyes. The space that had been her refuge for the past 8 months now held entirely new significance. This was where she had met the man who had been present at her husband's death, who had handled his final letters, who had carried concern for her across 2 years and multiple states. James returned to his corner booth, but the dynamic between them had changed completely. Occasionally their eyes would meet across the coffee shop, and, instead of the polite friendliness of customer and server, there was now the weight of shared history and mutual understanding. As the day progressed, Sarah found herself watching James with new awareness. Every gesture, every expression took on additional meaning now that she knew he had been part of Marcus's story. She began to notice things she had missed before, the way he sometimes stared off into space with a haunted expression, the careful way he avoided certain topics in conversation with other customers, the military precision with which he organized his belongings.
When closing time approached, Sarah realized that she was both excited and terrified about their dinner. James represented a connection to Marcus that she had never expected to find, but he also represented information about her husband's death that she wasn't sure she was ready to receive. As James packed up his things, he approached the counter one more time. "Sarah," he said, "I want you to know that if tonight feels like too much, if you decide you don't want to hear the stories I have to tell, that's completely okay. We can just have dinner and talk about anything else." Sarah appreciated his consideration, but she had already made her decision. "I want to know," she said firmly. "Whatever you can tell me about Marcus, I want to know it all." James nodded, understanding in his expression. "Then, I'll see you at 7. As Sarah finished closing the coffee shop, she found herself thinking about the strange turns life could take. 2 days ago, James had been just another customer. Yesterday, he had been her defender against cruel strangers. Today, he had become a bridge to a past she thought she would never be able to access again. She drove home with anticipation and anxiety warring in her chest, wondering what other revelations the evening would bring. The tattoo on her arm felt different now, less like a lonely memorial and more like a connection to stories she had yet to discover. For the first time since Marcus's death, Sarah felt like she might learn something new about the man she had loved, something that would help fill the gaps in her understanding of who he had been when they were apart. As she prepared for dinner, Sarah caught sight of herself in the mirror and made a decision that surprised her. For the first time in months, she chose a short-sleeved shirt, leaving her tattoo visible. If she was going to hear Marcus's stories from someone who had known him in that other life, she wanted him to see the art she had created in his memory. The memorial tattoo that had caused such cruel commentary from strangers would tonight be shared with someone who understood its true meaning, someone who had been there when the story it told came to its tragic end. Sarah had no idea what else the evening might reveal, but she was finally ready to find out. Betty's Diner was exactly the kind of place Sarah had expected to find in a small Tennessee town. Red vinyl booths, checkerboard floors, and the lingering smell of coffee and pie that spoke of decades of consistent comfort food. She arrived 5 minutes early, her nerves making it impossible to wait any longer at home, and chose a booth near the back where they could talk privately. When James walked through the door at exactly 7 o'clock, Sarah noticed immediately that he had changed clothes. Instead of his usual casual attire, he was wearing dress slacks and a button-down shirt that emphasized his military bearing. More importantly, she could see the edge of a tattoo peeking out from beneath his rolled-up sleeve. "I hope I didn't keep you waiting," James said as he slid into the booth across from her. "Not at all," Sarah replied, then gestured toward his arm. "I'm not the only one with tattoos." James glanced down at his forearm, where part of what looked like military insignia was visible. 28 years in the Corps leaves its mark in various ways," he said with a slight smile. "I noticed you decided not to hide yours tonight." Sarah looked down at her own exposed tattoo, the intricate design that covered most of her left forearm. The memorial piece was beautiful and complex, incorporating Marcus's name, his dates of service, military symbols, and personal elements that told the story of their relationship. "It felt wrong to hide it from you," she said. "Since you know what it really means." James studied the tattoo with obvious respect and recognition. "It's beautiful, Sarah. Marcus would have loved it." The simple statement hit her harder than she had expected. After months of strangers judging her ink based on their assumptions, having someone who had actually known Marcus approve of her memorial felt like validation she hadn't known she needed. A waitress approached their table, and they ordered coffee and pie more out of courtesy than hunger. The real nourishment they were seeking couldn't be found on a menu. "I have to admit," Sarah said once they were alone again, "I'm nervous about what you might tell me. For 2 years, my memories of Marcus have been all I had. The idea of learning new things about him is both exciting and terrifying." James nodded understanding. "I can imagine. But I want you to know that everything I learned about Marcus only confirmed what you already knew about him. He was exactly the man you thought he was." Sarah felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. "Tell me." James took a sip of his coffee, clearly organizing his thoughts. "The investigation into the incident took 4 days. During that time, I interviewed every member of Marcus's unit who was available. What emerged was a picture of a leader who was beloved by his soldiers.
He always said leadership was about service, not authority, Sarah said.
That came through loud and clear, James confirmed. His soldiers told me that Marcus never asked them to do anything he wouldn't do himself. When they had to pull guard duty in dangerous areas, Marcus would take the worst shifts. When supplies were short, Marcus would make sure his soldiers ate before he did.
Sarah felt tears starting to form.
These were the qualities she had loved in Marcus as a husband, his selflessness, his genuine care for others, but hearing that they had extended to his military service made her proud in a way she hadn't expected. There was one soldier in particular, a young private named Rodriguez, James continued.
Same last name as Marcus, though they weren't related.
This kid was having a really hard time adjusting to deployment life, and Marcus took him under his wing. Marcus never mentioned him in his letters, Sarah said.
I'm not surprised.
From what Rodriguez told me, Marcus never made a big deal about helping people.
He would just quietly make sure they had what they needed.
Rodriguez said Marcus spent hours with him, teaching him not just military skills but life skills. How to manage money, how to write letters home, how to deal with the stress of being so far from family. Sarah could picture Marcus doing exactly that. He had always been the person friends turned to when they needed advice or support, someone who seemed to instinctively know how to help others through difficult times. Rodriguez broke down crying when he told me about Marcus, James continued. He said Marcus had saved his life, not in some dramatic battlefield moment, but by making him feel like he belonged somewhere, like someone cared whether he succeeded or failed. That sounds like Marcus, Sarah said softly. There's more, James said. Marcus's commanding officer told me that he had been recommended for promotion twice during that deployment. Both times, Marcus turned it down because accepting the promotion would have meant leaving his unit, and he didn't want to abandon the soldiers who depended on him. Sarah stared at James in surprise. Marcus had never mentioned being offered promotions, and the fact that he had turned them down to stay with his soldiers revealed a level of dedication that took her breath away. He never told me about any of this, she said. I think that was Marcus, James replied gently. From everything I learned about him, he was the kind of person who did the right thing without needing recognition for it. His soldiers saw him as a hero, but I doubt Marcus saw himself that way.
He didn't, Sarah confirmed.
He always said he was just doing his job.
James smiled at that.
His commanding officer said the same thing. Apparently, every time Marcus was praised for his leadership or recommended for awards, he would say he was just doing what needed to be done. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both lost in thoughts about a man who had touched more lives than he had ever realized. Sarah was beginning to understand that her grief, while profound and personal, was shared by people she had never met, soldiers who had lost not just a leader but a mentor and friend.
James, Sarah said finally, can you tell me about the day he died?
James's expression grew serious, and Sarah could see him weighing his words carefully.
Are you sure you want to know the details?
I need to know, Sarah said firmly. The army told me he died in an IED explosion, but they never gave me specifics. I've spent 2 years imagining what might have happened, and I think the truth has to be better than my worst fears.
James nodded slowly.
Marcus was leading a convoy to deliver supplies to a smaller outpost. It was a routine mission, something they had done dozens of times before. The IED was buried in a road they had traveled safely many times. Sarah braced herself for the details she had been afraid to hear. Marcus's vehicle was the second in the convoy, James continued. When the explosion happened, it happened quickly. The soldiers I interviewed said there wouldn't have been time for fear or pain. Sarah felt a familiar tightness in her chest, but also a strange sense of relief. The not knowing had been torture, and even painful truth was preferable to endless uncertainty.
But here's what I really want you to know, James said, leaning forward with intensity.
In the chaos after the explosion, when everything was smoke and confusion and terror, Marcus's first instinct was to check on his soldiers. Even though he was injured, even though his own vehicle was destroyed, he was trying to get to the other vehicles to make sure his people were okay.
Sarah felt the tears she had been holding back finally spill over.
This was exactly who Marcus had been, someone whose first thought, even in his final moments, had been for the welfare of others. He died trying to help, she whispered. He died being exactly who he had always been, James confirmed. A leader who put his soldiers before himself. Sarah wiped her eyes, grateful for the privacy of their corner booth. The details were painful, but they were also somehow healing. For 2 years, she had tortured herself with imagined scenarios of Marcus's death, most of them involving fear, pain, and loneliness. To learn that he had died being heroic, that his final actions had been consistent with the man she had loved, gave her a peace she hadn't expected to find. "There's something else," James said quietly. "Something I found among Marcus's personal effects that I think you should know about." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, worn piece of paper. Sarah recognized it immediately as one of her letters, though it was more creased and faded than she remembered. "This is the letter where you wrote about your tattoo plans," James said, placing it carefully on the table between them. "But I want you to read the margin notes." Sarah picked up the letter with trembling hands. It was indeed the one where she had described her idea for a memorial tattoo that would tell Marcus's story. But, along the margins, in Marcus's familiar handwriting, were notes she had never seen before. "She's so beautiful," one note read next to a paragraph where Sarah had written about feeling insecure about his long deployment. "I can't wait to come home to her," was written next to her description of their future plans. And, at the bottom of the letter, next to her description of the tattoo design, Marcus had written, "She loves me enough to wear my story on her skin forever. I'm the luckiest man alive." Sarah couldn't speak. Seeing Marcus's handwriting again, reading his private thoughts about their relationship, was like receiving a message from beyond the grave. She had known he loved her, but seeing the evidence of how he had treasured her letters, how he had been thinking about her in his final days, overwhelmed her completely. "He carried this letter in his front pocket," James said softly. "Separate from all the others. When we found it, it was clear he had read it constantly." "I had no idea," Sarah managed through her tears. "I never knew he was writing notes on my letters." "I think he was having conversations with you," James said. "Even when you weren't there, he was responding to your words, thinking about your life together." Sarah studied the letter more carefully, finding other marginal notes she had missed on her first read. Next to a paragraph where she had worried about bothering him with everyday details, Marcus had written, "I love every detail of your life. Tell me everything." "This changes everything," Sarah said finally. "All this time, I thought my letters were just my way of staying connected to him. I never realized they were such a lifeline for him too." According to his soldiers, Marcus would get excited for days whenever mail arrived, James confirmed. "He would read your letters over and over, sharing funny parts with the other soldiers, talking about what you were planning for when he came home." The waitress refilled their coffee cups, giving Sarah a moment to compose herself. She carefully folded the letter and handed it back to James, but he shook his head. "Keep it," he said. "It belongs with you." Sarah clutched the letter to her chest, feeling like she had been given a precious gift. "Thank you. For saving this, for finding me, for everything." "Actually," James said, "I need to thank you." "For what?" "For helping me understand something I've been struggling with for 2 years," James said. "I've been carrying guilt about Marcus's death, feeling like I should have done more, should have prevented it somehow. But, seeing you tonight, seeing how you've honored his memory, seeing the strength you've shown in rebuilding your life, it helps me understand that some things are beyond our control." Sarah was surprised by this confession. She had been so focused on her own grief that she hadn't considered how Marcus's death might have affected the people who had to handle the aftermath. "You couldn't have prevented what happened to Marcus," she said firmly. "And, from what you've told me, you honored him by making sure his soldiers' stories were heard, by treating his personal effects with respect, by caring enough about his widow to track her down 2 years later." James smiled, but Sarah could see the weight he was still carrying. "There's something else I haven't told you. Something about my role in the investigation." Sarah felt her stomach tighten. "What do you mean?" James took a deep breath. "I wasn't just any Marine doing paperwork. I was the investigating officer. It was my job to determine what went wrong, whether proper procedures were followed, whether anyone was at fault for the explosion that killed Marcus and the others. Sarah stared at him, trying to process this new information.
And what did you find?
That there was no fault, no negligence, no one to blame. It was just war, just the terrible randomness of violence in a place where people were trying to kill American soldiers. But that didn't make it easier to write the reports, to catalog the personal effects of 4 good men who died doing their jobs. Sarah began to understand the weight James had been carrying. He hadn't just been a peripheral figure in Marcus's story, he had been the person responsible for making sense of a senseless tragedy, for finding answers where no satisfying answers existed.
Is that why you came to find me? She asked.
Because you felt responsible?
Partly, James admitted.
But mostly because I needed to know that something good had survived the tragedy. Marcus talked about you so much, loved you so obviously, that you became real to me even though we had never met. I needed to know that his love for you hadn't died with him.
Sarah felt a new understanding of James's motivations.
He hadn't just been curious about her welfare, he had been seeking his own kind of healing, his own way to make sense of loss and grief.
And now that you found me, she asked.
James smiled, and, for the first time since she had known him, the expression reached his eyes completely.
Now I know that love like yours and Marcus's doesn't just disappear.
It transforms into something else, something that honors the person you've lost while still allowing you to build a new life. They sat in comfortable silence as the diner began to empty around them. Sarah felt like she had been given gifts she hadn't known she needed, new stories about Marcus, evidence of his love for her, and a connection to someone who had been part of his final chapter.
James, she said finally, I know you said you were just passing through town, but would you consider staying in Millbrook for a while?
Not for me, she added quickly, but for yourself.
This town has been good to me while I've been healing. Maybe it could be good for you too. James considered the suggestion.
I don't really have anywhere else I need to be.
My retirement hasn't been particularly purposeful so far.
The coffee shop could use a regular customer who understands military life, Sarah said with a smile. And I could use a friend who knew Marcus.
I'd like that, James said. I'd like that very much.
As they prepared to leave the diner, Sarah realized that the evening had given her something she hadn't expected to find, hope for the future. Not hope that her grief would disappear or that she would stop missing Marcus, but hope that she could continue building a life that honored his memory while still allowing for new connections and experiences. The tattoo on her arm felt different as they walked to their cars. Instead of being just her private memorial to a lost love, it had become a bridge between past and present, a conversation starter with someone who had known Marcus in ways she never could.
Same time tomorrow at the coffee shop? James asked as they reached their vehicles. Absolutely, Sarah replied. And, James? Thank you for giving me new pieces of Marcus's story. It means more than you could possibly know.
As Sarah drove home, she thought about the strange ways life could surprise you. 3 days ago, she had been a widow working in a coffee shop, trying to heal from a loss that felt insurmountable. Tonight, she was still a widow, still healing, but she was no longer alone with her memories. She had found someone who had known Marcus, who could tell her story she had never heard, who understood both the love she had lost and the strength she had found. The future was still uncertain, still shaped by grief and the daily work of rebuilding a life that had been shattered. But, for the first time in 2 years, Sarah felt like she might not have to do that work entirely alone. And, somehow, she thought Marcus would have approved of the unexpected friendship that had grown from the intersection of their separate stories of loss and healing. 3 weeks had passed since that life-changing dinner at Betty's Diner, and the rhythm of life at Sunrise Coffee had settled into something Sarah had never experienced before, the comfort of genuine friendship built on shared understanding. James had indeed decided to stay in Millbrook, renting a small apartment above the hardware store down the street from the coffee shop. True to his word, he had become the shop's most reliable customer, arriving every morning at 9 o'clock sharp for his black coffee and spending most of the day working quietly in his corner booth. But their relationship had deepened beyond customer and server. James had stories about Marcus that he shared slowly, carefully, understanding that each new piece of information about her husband was both a gift and a small reopening of old wounds. Sarah, in turn, had found herself sharing memories of Marcus that she had never told anyone, the private jokes, the quiet moments, the dreams they had built together that would never be fulfilled. The three cruel women had not returned to the coffee shop, though Sarah occasionally saw their expensive SUV passing on the street. The memory of their mockery felt distant now, defanged by James's defense and his explanation of what her tattoos really represented. Other customers had begun to notice her memorial art as well, but their reactions had been respectful curiosity rather than judgment. It was on a Thursday morning, during the usual lull between breakfast and lunch rushes, that everything changed again. Sarah was wiping down tables when she noticed James staring intently at something on his tablet, his expression more serious than usual. She had learned to recognize his different moods over the past weeks, the distant look when he was remembering Afghanistan, the focused concentration when he was reading something important, the gentle smile that appeared when he was thinking about their conversations. But this expression was new, a mixture of shock, concern, and what looked like panic. "James," she called softly. "Is everything okay?" He looked up from his tablet, and Sarah was startled to see that his face had gone pale. "Sarah, I need to tell you something. Something I should have told you weeks ago." The serious tone of his voice made Sarah's stomach clench with familiar anxiety. She had learned to be wary of statements like that, conversations that began with apologies for withheld information. "What is it?" she asked, moving closer to his booth. James gestured for her to sit down, then turned his tablet around so she could see the screen. It was displaying a news article with a headline that made no immediate sense to her: "Local Marine Colonel honored for veteran outreach work." Sarah read the headline again, confused. "I don't understand. What does this have to do with us?" "Read the article," James said quietly. Sarah began reading, and, with each paragraph, her confusion grew deeper. The article described a retired Marine colonel named James Mitchell who had spent the past 5 years working with veteran support organizations, helping military families navigate the complex systems of benefits and grief counseling. The work was being honored by the state of Tennessee, and Colonel Mitchell was being recognized for his exceptional dedication to ensuring that no military family faces their struggles alone. "James," Sarah said slowly, looking up from the tablet, "this is about you." "Yes. But it says you're a colonel. You told me you were just doing administrative work in Afghanistan." James took a deep breath, clearly struggling with how to explain. "That was true. I was doing administrative work. But I wasn't just any administrative officer. I was the commanding officer of the Marine unit responsible for joint operations coordination in the region." Sarah stared at him, trying to process what he was telling her. "You were a colonel when you investigated Marcus's death?" "Yes." The simple word hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had spent weeks thinking of James as someone who had been peripherally involved in the aftermath of Marcus's death, a mid-level Marine who had happened to be assigned to handle paperwork. The idea that he had been the commanding officer responsible for the investigation changed everything about their relationship. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because I was afraid you would see me differently," James said. "I was afraid you would stop seeing me as just James who drinks black coffee and listens to your stories, and start seeing me as Colonel Mitchell who was responsible for investigating your husband's death." Sarah felt a mixture of hurt and confusion washing over her. "But that's who you are. That's who you were when Marcus died." "Yes," James admitted. "And I've been carrying the weight of that responsibility for 2 years." Sarah studied his face, seeing new layers of complexity and expressions she had thought she understood. "What aren't you telling me, James? What really happened with Marcus's investigation?" James closed his eyes for a moment, and, when he opened them, Sarah saw a pain that went deeper than anything she had observed before. "The investigation into the IED attack that killed Marcus and 3 other soldiers," he said slowly, "led to information about intelligence failures. Someone had known that route was being targeted by insurgents, but that information didn't make it down to the units in the field." Sarah felt her heart start to race. "Are you saying Marcus's death could have been prevented?" "I'm saying that there were systematic failures in how intelligence was shared between different command structures. The attack that killed Marcus wasn't random bad luck.
It was the result of communication breakdowns that left soldiers vulnerable when they should have been protected. The words hit Sarah like a tsunami.
For 2 years, she had been told that Marcus's death was simply the tragic randomness of war, an unavoidable consequence of serving in a dangerous place. The idea that it might have been preventable, that someone's mistakes had cost Marcus his life, was almost too much to bear. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" she demanded, her voice rising despite her efforts to stay calm.
"Because my report was classified," James said.
"Because the families of the soldiers who died were never told about the intelligence failures.
Because the military decided that the pain of knowing wouldn't serve any useful purpose."
Sarah stood up abruptly, pacing to the window and back, trying to process the magnitude of what James was telling her.
"So you've been carrying this secret for 2 years? While I've been grieving a death I thought was unavoidable, you've known that someone's negligence killed my husband?"
"Sarah, please," James said, standing as well.
"It's more complicated than that." "How is it more complicated?" Sarah asked, tears streaming down her face.
"Either Marcus's death was preventable or it wasn't."
"It was preventable," James said quietly.
"But the people responsible for the intelligence failures weren't malicious. They were overworked, understaffed, dealing with impossible amounts of information. The system failed, but it failed because of structural problems, not because individuals didn't care." Sarah felt like the ground was shifting beneath her feet. Everything she had believed about Marcus's death, everything she had told herself to make sense of his loss, was being rewritten in real time.
"Is that supposed to make me feel better?" she asked. "That Marcus died because of bureaucratic incompetence instead of enemy action?"
"No," James said firmly.
"Nothing is supposed to make you feel better about losing Marcus."
"But I thought you deserved to know that his death led to changes in how intelligence is shared. That other soldiers are safer because of what happened to him." Sarah sank back into the booth, overwhelmed by the collision of grief, anger, and confusion.
"Why are you telling me this now? Why today?" James gestured toward his tablet. "Because that news article is going to lead to media attention I can't control.
Because my work with veteran families is being recognized publicly, and it's only a matter of time before someone starts asking questions about my background, about specific cases I've worked on."
"And you were afraid I would find out from someone else." "I was afraid you would feel betrayed," James corrected.
"Which, judging by your reaction, is exactly what's happening." Sarah wiped her eyes, trying to think clearly through the emotional storm.
"I do feel betrayed, James.
Not because you investigated Marcus's death, but because you let me believe for weeks that you were just some random Marine who happened to be there."
"I was trying to protect you." "From what? From the truth about my own husband's death?"
James was quiet for a long moment, clearly struggling with how to respond.
"From the guilt I've been carrying for 2 years." "What guilt?"
"The guilt of knowing that I was ultimately responsible for the intelligence coordination that failed Marcus and the others. The guilt of writing a classified report that exposed systematic failures while the families were told it was just bad luck. The guilt of being the commanding officer who was supposed to keep soldiers safe, and failing."
Sarah stared at James with new understanding.
The weight he had been carrying wasn't just the general.